Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I just introduced myself, but my name is Tyler Fitch, and I'll be testifying on behalf of Vote Solar, where I work as Regulatory Director for the Carolinas. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. My direct testimony identifies and discusses a specific set of material business risks to Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas and their implications on resource planning. These risks are called climate-related risks because they relate to the physical, economic, and financial challenges driven by a changing climate. My testimony also assesses the company's plans in light of these risks and provides recommendations for integrating these risks in the future. I'll begin my summary by quickly defining climate-related risk, and I'll call that climate risk for short as I go through this. Climate-related risks are potential negative impacts to an entity that arise from either physical risks or the physical impacts of a changing climate, or transition risks, which include economic and financial implications of adapting to a warming world and transitioning to a zero-carbon economy. Since the climate-related risk framework was created by a network of central banks in 2015, it has emerged as a driving force in economic and financial decision-making. BlackRock, for example, which is Duke Energy's second largest single shareholder and the largest asset manager in the world, stated in 2019 that risks and opportunities related to climate change are driving a, quote, fundamental reshaping of finance. And when a group of investors sent a letter to Duke Energy requesting a net zero carbon commitment and describing climate-related risks as significant and material in February 2019, Duke Energy complied 7 months later. Like all other utilities with long-lived assets and significant carbon emissions, the companies have substantial exposure to climate-related risks. The companies are exposed to physical risks from weather events and changes to load, financial risks as shareholders adjust their appetite to carbon-intense investment, regulatory risks from future state or federal regulation, economic risks from cost-competitive zero-carbon generation or carbon-conscious customers sourcing energy elsewhere, and even reputational risks from potentially failing to meet their carbon commitments. Importantly, costs and negative impacts sustained by the companies due to these risks could well result in less affordable and less reliable service for its ratepayers. In this way, integrating climate-related risks is not in conflict with pursuing affordability or reliability, and in fact, these goals are tightly connected. Managing long-term risks to affordability was in fact the intention behind creating integrated resources planning in the 1970s and 80s. As climate-related risks continue to accelerate, consideration of those risks should rightly be incorporated into the resource planning process. Planning ahead is so critical here because climate-related risks are path-dependent. Investment decisions that we make today have long-term implications for risk and can either open or close different possibilities for the grid of the future. To state it plainly, declining to act to manage climate risks today could make every option more expensive down the line. I recommend that the commission, identify climate-related risks as a relevant factor for resource planning in the public interest and evaluate the plans presented before it accordingly. So with this standard in mind, I reviewed the company's filed integrated resource plan, company's witness testimonies, and discovery responses to determine whether the company's plans adequately manage climate-related risks. I did this in 3 ways. First, do the plans appropriately assess climate-related risks to the company's assets and operations? Second, do the plans consider strategies that would mitigate climate-related risks and drive incremental cost benefits? And third, do the plans appropriately evaluate cost impacts of climate-related risks? I find that the plans fail to accomplish any of these objectives, and I'll provide a brief summary of my findings and recommendations. In preparation of these plans, the companies declined to conduct any systematic assessment of climate-related risks. And despite the foreseeable impacts to relevant inputs like load forecasts or unit heat rates, the companies declined to integrate climate-related physical impacts into plan creation. Finally, the company's reference carbon prices are substantially lower than the reference federal policies or bills identified within the plans. To provide a clear assessment, I recommend that the companies undertake a systematic climate risk assessment, including physical risks, and adopt the reference carbon prices used in the U.S. Energy Information Administration's 2020 Annual Energy Outlook. The plans also fail to consider strategies to mitigate climate-related risks and drive customer benefits. For example, the plans do not yet capture the full potential value of distributed energy resources or increased regional coordination for decarbonization or affordability. The plans also apply conservative assumptions to solar interconnection that curtail consideration of cost-effective renewables. The companies should provide transparency on the role of distributed energy resources and the potential for regional coordination while applying scrutiny to unduly conservative estimates on interconnection. Finally, the plans fail to appropriately evaluate the potential costs incurred by these risks. In particular, the plans provide little meaningful assessment of the long-term carbon implications of the investments envisioned in their plans. In simple terms, it is difficult to reconcile the base case with carbon policy's build-out of 7.3 gigawatts of long-lived carbon-emitting resources with its commitment to a net zero carbon system by 2050. I explore this issue further in the carbon stranding report attached to my testimony, and I find that gas-fired carbon-emitting assets envisioned in the plan's base case with carbon policy scenario would lock the companies into substantial emissions through mid-century. And in order to comply with its carbon commitment, the companies would need to remove these units from generation, creating almost $5 billion in stranded asset costs for ratepayers. These costs, or alternatively, an explicit plan from the companies to avoid them, do not appear in the plans. While substantial stranded asset costs represent just one way the climate-related impacts are not appropriately evaluated. While the plans discuss carbon capture and storage or hydrogen fuels at a high level, they do not include due consideration of the cost impacts or feasibility of such investments. To further complicate the issue, the plan's evaluation of revenue requirement assumes little difference in cost trajectory between scenarios over the 2040 to 2050 timeframe, despite the clear difference in implied need for decarbonization. To better evaluate these potential costs, I provide several recommendations to be implemented in a future plan. They start with explicitly considering the company's net zero pathway in the generation of its integrated resource plans and providing a unit level explanation of how carbon emitting assets will continue to generate through mid-century. In conclusion, 21st century climate informed resource planning presents the Commission with a substantial challenge. It must chart a course for long-term planning in an industry that is experiencing its most dramatic transformation since its creation. Climate-driven trends from physical events to economic and financial pressures will drive substantial change in how we meet our energy needs over the next decades. The integrated resource planning process provides the Commission the tools to assess the implications of those trends and ensure that South Carolina ratepayers continue to be served with affordable, reliable, and sustainable power through the 21st century. What South Carolina ratepayers cannot afford is continuing with planning processes that ignore these trends. Given that these plans fail to integrate climate-related risks, they should not be accepted as the most prudent and reasonable option for South Carolina ratepayers. The conclusions and recommendations provided in my testimony provide helpful suggestions on how future plans could get things right. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.